On this day, June 1st, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History marks the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, when on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, in Oklahoma, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, also known as Black Wall Street, was destroyed by white rioters when hundreds of black men, women, and children were killed. This was not the first nor the last occurrence of domestic terrorism against black communities in the United States in the early decades of the 20th century. In 1917, white rioters devastated the black community in East St. Louis, and in 1919, as the United States returned to normalcy after World War I, black people in cities throughout America, including our nation's capital, were attacked by white rioters in what came to be named the Red Summer because of the extensive loss of black life and property. 2 years after Tulsa, in 1923, a white mob would plunder the black community of Rosewood, Florida. Tulsa, however, experienced the greatest destruction of all. This infamous story in Oklahoma's and our nation's history is the subject of the excellent documentary film Tulsa Burning, produced by NBA superstar and philanthropist Russell Westbrook and co-directed by Peabody and award-winning director Stanley Nelson, and 3 times nominee for the Sundance Film Festival Grand Jury Prize, Marco Williams. The documentary aired on the History Channel on Sunday, May 30th, and is the inspiration for ASALH's program, Surviving the Tulsa Race Massacre, Voices of Resistance Then and Now. You will hear from historians, as well as from 3 Tulsa survivors who have left to us their powerful voices of remembrance and resistance, even though they are no longer with us. What the presenters have in common is membership in ASALH. Our first speaker, Dr. Brittney Cooper, history professor at Rutgers University, was a significant contributor to the film Tulsa Burning. Dr. Olivia Juliet Hooker and Dr. John Hope Franklin were actual survivors of the Tulsa Massacre. Dr. John W. Franklin, who is retired from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, will share the words of his grandfather, Buck Franklin, who lived and practiced law in Greenwood in 1921. Finally, we will hear from ASALH's National President, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham of Harvard University, who will discuss the survivors' legal battle for reparative justice in the 21st century. Let us never forget the Tulsa Race Massacre, and let us always remember that the quest for justice continues.
Good evening, ASALH members. It's my pleasure to chat with you a bit about Tulsa Burning, the documentary, and this season where we remember 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. When I was thinking about what I might share, I thought that I would really just situate this massacre and the aftermath of it in terms of 2 major strains in African American life that would have been happening in the 1920s, and then to just reflect for a bit about what I think this story means, what I have taken from it, what I think is useful or relevant. From my perspective as one who works somewhere in between literature, cultural studies, and intellectual history. So first, when in late May, Dick Rowland or Rowland, the 19-year-old Black elevator operator in Tulsa, was accused of assaulting a young white woman who also worked as an elevator operator, although, it became clear pretty soon that not even, white residents believed that he had really done this. He entered into a tradition of Black men being accused of sexual violence towards white women in very spurious ways, under very dubious circumstances. And so he became part of a long history of anti-lynching or these sort of trumped up charges around lynching. And this had really been the core of Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching campaign, launched in 1892. So nearly exactly 30 years before this moment, in which she made really clear that lynchings undertaken by white mobs were never actually about Black male violence or the ways in which Black men were somehow unsafe towards other folks, particularly white women, but rather it was about a kind of jealousy, right, and competitiveness, typically over the economic well-being of Black folks. So you have this prosperous section of the city, the Greenwood neighborhood, dozens of blocks of Black wealth, opulent Black wealth in some cases, but more so just Black people doing well for themselves and making a way, during the nadir of race relations, right? We typically think of that period as 1880 to 1920, really the sort of setting in of Jim Crow, the cementing of Jim Crow, the formal end of Reconstruction, the institution of separate but equal. And so right on the other side of that nadir, you see Black communities, responding by taking the collective wealth of the community and trying to build. And doing so to great success in the Greenwood community there in Tulsa. This story then also puts this at the nexus of another set of things that we know well. Typically, we refer to the 1920s in this country as the Harlem Renaissance, and certainly lots of literary scholars have, stretched the periodization of the Harlem Renaissance. So not quite a strict start in 1920, not quite a strict end at the end of the Great Depression, but really this period of literary and cultural ferment. And while it's often called the Harlem Renaissance, or more specifically, the New Negro Renaissance, we tend to think of it in the scholarship in terms of what's happening in major urban areas outside of the South. So Harlem in New York, Washington, D.C., or Chicago. What I love about Greenwood and about Tulsa is that it actually asks us to go back and to revisit our understanding of the 1920s as not just a narrative about the Great Migration and about the thriving of these kind of Black urban centers, although that's part of the narrative, but to remember that you actually have these thriving communities also below the Mason-Dixon, even though I know Washington, D.C. is technically below the Mason-Dixon. One of the things that alerted me to thinking about that in the Tulsa story is that some of the historical work I do, one of my historical public history projects, it's my baby. I am from both Ruston and Shreveport, Louisiana, and Shreveport, which is in the northwest corner of Louisiana, had a bustling Black community like this in the 1920s, and had a place that they called the Avenue, where there was sort of where Black businesses and Black social life was concentrated. And, it wasn't at the scale of Greenwood, but it was one of these kinds of communities that would have been in conversation with a place like Greenwood. And so I think that there is work to be done for future historians thinking about what did the 1920s look like in all of these outside of sort of major Black urban metropolises. What did that period look like? And I think that there becomes a really interesting story. And so then Tulsa is a part of that. And so as you've seen in the documentary and know the story, essentially this community says, we're not going to let these white men lynch this Black boy. And so what I also love is that this is a community that believes deeply in self-determination. And so they engage in armed self-defense. The brothers get together and they get their guns together and they say, this is not the kind of justice that we want. And in that way, they're also in the tradition of Ida B. Wells, who believed very deeply, even before she began her anti-lynching campaign, in the right of Black communities for armed self-defense. And I think that too becomes very important when we think about these broader histories of racial rebellion, is that this wasn't a situation in which, it brings me to my third point, which is that Tulsa was not a community that, fits these narratives of shame that we have imbibed, particularly in the contemporary moment. What do I mean by that? Well, when you hang out with Black folks, we sitting around and we're having good food and drink, and, it's intramural Black life, as Hortense Spillers calls it. And, we're not in the presence of white folks. We'll often say to each other, well, why can't we just get together and pool our money and own our things, right? Why can't we just get together and do that? Why can't we be like other immigrant groups? Not the ones who, we were here through forced migration, which is clearly not the same, right? But why can't we be like them? Because they live together in community and they pool their resources, and then they own stores and they shop, and we have this narrative about Black collective economics in which we tell it as a narrative of failure, that we have been enamored with integration, and that we therefore just never got it. And I think what happens when you look at Tulsa is that you realize that that's absolutely not true, and that at the height of, at least until we got to this period, one of the earliest, and most brutal periods of racial repression post enslavement in this country, Black people did practice collective economics, and they weren't particularly trying to go integrate with white folks. They were using Black money and Black communal ties to build a wonderful neighborhood. And the response of white supremacy was sheer violence, right? The response of white supremacy to what we would call today like a 19th century version, an early 20th century version of a stand your ground law, that, we can defend our property and our people, was to massacre this community. So, as I have said previously about this, when we think about Tulsa and we think about in the contemporary moment, this narrative that we tell about, about why we can't engage in collective economics, and why, our people, they don't fight back, right? So, these are the kids wearing the t-shirts, "Not Your Mama's Civil Rights Movement." It's all a narrative of shame, and it's ahistorical. And I would say, simply like quoting Underground, the show Underground, the shame is not ours, right? The shame is not ours. We have robustly imagined Black possibility and self-determination at every opportunity, and our continual boogeyman, that is an actual boogeyman, an actual adversary, is the continuing problem of a violent, racially repressive white supremacy that will take up arms in the face of Black excellence. And so I think that we have to reclaim our own story, our own histories of self-determination and self-defense, our own histories of collective determination, collective economics, and take pride in what this story means, and remember that we are in a long legacy of possibility, and then I think we use it to go forward from here.
We generally call it the catastrophe because we feel like it wasn't a riot. We were not the perpetrators, we were the victims. But it took 80 years to get the state of Oklahoma to acknowledge that. Rumor has it that the young man who was a window washer at a downtown place had 2 buckets of water that he was taking upstairs to the 4th floor to go to the only bathroom that Black people could use in the downtown area. And that he stumbled because the elevator was not even. And so he grabbed at the elevator operator, who was a 17-year-old non-Black person. And of course she screamed, and people said he attacked her. So they put him in jail. We learned later, of course, they put him in jail. And then the Tulsa Tribune was a Hearst newspaper that came out and said, "Negro to be lynched tonight." Nobody can find a copy of that paper. They managed to destroy them all. But of course, the Black men who had just come back from World War I still had guns, and they said, "We'll go down and help the sheriff." So they went down and offered to help guard the young man until he could have a proper trial. And the sheriff said, "I don't need any help. I can protect him." But a crowd gathered there, and when they saw how outnumbered they were, they said, "We better stay." And one man who had a gun, and he was a professional man, was approached by one of the intruders, and they said, "What are you going to do with that gun?" And he said, "I'm going to use it if I have to." And that started it. They shot him. He died before he could get to the hospital. And the shooting started. Well, the black men had been to World War I, and they were pretty good shots. But we never got an accurate figure of how many people were killed, because they did not want those young men to know how many of them perished. And my father always told us that they piled the bodies of the non-blacks into boxes, wooden boxes, and dropped them in the Arkansas River marked with the N word. So nobody has ever dug up a box of them, but my father said that was to camouflage so that they wouldn't know how successful they were. Well, so they didn't start to burn and pillage until they decided, well, all right, we have to teach them a lesson. The Ku Klux decided we have to teach them a lesson. So actually, we as children didn't hear any noise or any shots the night of the 31st of May. But on June 1st, they began to systematically destroy neighborhoods. And they had airplanes dropping things down on people's houses, and they had made up their minds to clear the entire area of black people. So most of the people fled. When they saw houses burning and the streets behind them, they left. But my mother was determined not to flee, and she poured water on everything she could put water on, trying to make the house safe so it wouldn't burn. But the first thing they did when the militia came was to take all the men, and they took my 8-year-old brother too, to a place, bullpen or some place where they were holding all the black men. And we didn't know, because we lived on one side of town and they lived on the other, we didn't know they weren't doing the same thing. The militia, you have to obey the militia, so we thought they were locking up the non-blacks too. But it so happened that it didn't occur that way. What they did was to disarm and lock up all black men. And then they said to the mob, there's nothing out there now but women and children, so you can do whatever you want to do. And that was when the real terrible things started to happen, because they would invade your house. And my mother had a very strong will. She was a Tuskegee graduate, and she had been trained to teach. But she decided, well, we have to eat no matter what's happening out there in the world. So she had 3 triangular pots that you could put 3 pots on one gas eye on the stove. So she was cooking, and she made biscuits, and they were in the oven. Well, when the crowd came in to pillage and burn, they were infuriated, because here's this woman cooking cream of wheats and making applesauce and cooking biscuits, instead of being terrified and running from us. So I think they thought they had to teach us a special lesson. So they took the food out. Of course, the children are cowering under this big oak table where my mother had put us. And then we saw them take our food out and throw it in the dirt. And then they came back and got the biscuits and took them out and stomped them in the dirt. And then they came back in to destroy whatever they didn't want to take with them. So they went after my sister's piano. They didn't know that it's the sounding board of a piano that is important. So they just took hatchets and chopped at the piano. It was upright. And then they went after the phonograph. And my mother had records. So they first selected all the Caruso records, which she loved as dearly as she loved her children. And they broke up the Caruso records. But they didn't break the old rugged cross. They were trying to give us a message. And I've often said they didn't break Paul Robeson and they didn't break Roland Hayes because they didn't know who they were. You see, if they had known those were black artists, they would have smashed those first, you know. And they took, like my mother's luggage, but they didn't take my sister's little wicker basket that she brought home from college. And they had already pillaged the downtown that, was dubbed Black Wall Street. It was a prosperous neighborhood, but it wasn't a Wall Street. And my father's store was very well stocked, so they took everything they could take. And they had horses and buggies and different things to carry things in. And then they destroyed the building, which my dad was renting. He didn't own the building on Greenwood. And it was reduced to rubble, actually. So my parents were very distressed because here they are with 5 kids. And the schools had been. I went to Dunbar School, and that was reduced to just rubble. I mean, they blew it up, and they burned and the furniture, I guess, in the school, and blew the school up. And so my parents were very concerned about having 5 kids and no school. And my father was walking around through the rubble, I guess mourning. And he said his safe looked all right. It didn't look destroyed. So he went over to the safe. It was too big for them to carry on a horse, And so he went over to the safe and worked his combination, and everything was intact. But he didn't have cash. He didn't keep cash in there, but he had other people's money. People who were lucky or in some way would come and bring a little bag of money and put their name and address on, say, Mr. Hooker, keep this till I need it. And so he had a chance to give people back, all the ones he could find, their money that they had put in his safe.
My father was a lawyer, and he had been living with us in Rentersville, a village, an all-black village, for a number of years. But it was not really sufficient in size or in interest, legal interest, for him to be an active and successful lawyer there. And so in February 1921, my mother and father decided that he should go to Tulsa, a much larger city, and a place where there was a fairly considerable black community, and where he could perhaps make a living practicing law. And so he went there and left us in Rentersville, where my mother was teaching school. And we were in school. I was in elementary school, and so was my sister. My older brother and sister were away in boarding school. My father went on to Tulsa, and he would bring us there at the end of the school term in May or June 1921. And we looked forward to that with great pleasure. And we were all packed and ready to go. And he was to come for us and escort us to Tulsa. It's about 60 miles north, and we would go on the train. We were waiting for him to come, and he didn't come, and he didn't come, and he didn't come. And I cannot imagine the anxiety that my mother had. I was only 6 years old, and I was anxious enough to see my daddy and to get out of Rentersville and go to Tulsa, a big city. But we were shocked to find that he did not come. And my mother was, of course, distraught and anxious about him. We couldn't find out anything. This time there's no radio, no telephone, no means of communication at all, except that now and then you got a newspaper that might be dropped off in Rentersville. And so, as luck would have it, the Muskogee Daily Phoenix was dropped off one day. And my mother, in reading the paper, discovered that there had been a race riot in Tulsa and that there were many casualties. But she still hadn't heard from him and did not know whether he was in the riot, and if he was, whether he was living or dead. She just didn't know. And so we had several more days of anxiety before we finally got a note from my father. He had been detained during the entire riot, put in a place of detention, the convention hall, where he spent a number of days. And when he got out of there, the entire black section of Tulsa had been leveled to the ground. And the place that he got for us to live in was no longer in existence at all. It was just ashes, as indeed his office was, as everything was, ashes. And so this note from him told us that although he was safe, sound, everything he had gone up in smoke, that he could not bring us to Tulsa, and that as soon as he could, he would come and see us. Meanwhile, he had clients that he was servicing. He was practicing law in a tent, and he was suing the state, suing the city, suing insurance companies for damages that he hoped to receive in behalf of his clients. So in that sense, the riot gave him an opportunity to practice law, but it meant that we could not move, we could not join him. And we were destined to stay in Rentersville for 4 more years, by which time he could recover from the devastating losses which he had suffered from the riot, and perhaps we could then move, as we did in December 1925. The city had been allegedly involved in the riot in that they had deputized the state troopers and others, and had made it possible for them to come and join in the melee against the blacks in Tulsa. It was the city there, though, that had deputized citizens of the city and placed guns and so forth in their hands, and made it possible for them to invade the black section of town, to loot the houses and to burn them down. And that was what my father was suing the city about. But the state was also implicated. It all started because of an incident, alleged incident, on an elevator of all places, where a young white girl accused a young black man of assaulting her, attempted assault. That case had already been tried, and he'd been acquitted, and then he was retried, though, after the riot, and he was acquitted again. There was no evidence against him. But the loss of property and of lives, several hundred people were killed, and most of the area where African Americans lived was leveled to the ground, absolutely leveled to the ground. Only the high school or the school building and a few other buildings were kept. The entire time of my living in Tulsa, from 1925 to 1931, when I went away to college, in that entire time I witnessed the effort on the part of African Americans to rebuild their churches, to rebuild their schools, to rebuild their community institutions, and it was a shocking experience, which, although I was not there for the riot, I would never recover from it.
February 20th, 1921. Tulsa has a bustling black community. Tulsa is the oil capital of the world at this time. And he writes in his autobiography, My Life and an Era, that my father and I edited and published, the following. May 31st, 1921. I sat in the courtroom that afternoon among other attorneys. There was a short recess. The judge had gone to his chambers to settle some legal matter. Close by, I heard some lawyers in serious discussion. I heard one of them say, I don't believe a damn word of it. Another said, it doesn't seem reasonable. The first speaker said, why, I know that boy and I have known him a good while. That's not in him. Then the judge emerged from his chambers and assumed his docket. When my matter was disposed of, I left for my office, not dreaming that there were dark, threatening forebodings riding the air. Then as I walked leisurely along the sidewalk, I heard the sharp, shrill voice of a newsboy. "A Negro assaults a white girl." At the next newsstand, I purchased a paper and hurried to my office. I came across the article broadcast by the paper vendor. Then it dawned upon me that this was what the lawyers at the courthouse were talking about. Even then, I was not disturbed. I simply dismissed the whole matter from my mind, secure in the belief that the man had already been arrested and jailed, and that he would be properly and legally punished if found to be guilty. Then my mind turned to my family and our reunion. The girl would be coming in from college. I'd be done with eating in restaurants. I was just about ready to close my office and go to my room for the evening when some fellow came in and said there was going to be a race riot. That as he was coming from his work across town, he saw hundreds of men coming into the city and heard them cursing and swearing and saying they were going to get that damn nigger. Went on to my rooming house and up to my room. It was dusk when Mrs. Thompson knocked on my door. I opened it and admitted her. In her great excitement, she said, "It sure looks ugly out on the streets. There is talk of taking Roland from jail and lynching him, and that some young Negroes say it won't be. There's a crowd on the corner and more are coming." I rushed from my room, went down the steps in double quick time, and crossed the street where a huge menacing crowd was congregating. I soon spotted the leaders, a white and a Negro. I stood at the outer edge of the crowd and listened. There was no doubt that these men had seen active service in World War I. They fired up the crowd, telling about their exploits in the different battles, how they spent nights together in the same foxholes, that winning a battle did not always depend on numerical strength, but on strategy and surprise attack. That's when the white soldier suggested that someone should proceed across town immediately and set fire to houses in different parts of the city. That would take the pressure off the Negro part of the city and cause the governor to immediately dispatch soldiers to the scene. He said, "If you don't do this, they're going to burn you out before this thing is finished." That's when I moved to the center and warned against such a move with all the persuasion at my command. I must have made a strong appeal because the crowd commenced to melt away. Not one white home was burned. As the two departed together, the white soldier paused to remark, "This sort of battle is as much mine as it is yours. A great mob is forming, and you are at a disadvantage you can never overcome in an open fight." I had never seen either of these men before or since. I tried hard to reach Sheriff McCullough for several hours, but was unsuccessful, and I learned that the wires were cut. At daybreak, I went to my office, still believing that I could get to the sheriff's office, but I saw I was too late. Hundreds of men with drawn guns were approaching from every direction. As I could see as I stood on the steps of my office, and I was immediately arrested and taken to one of the many detention camps. Even then, airplanes were circling overhead, dropping explosives upon the buildings that had been looted, and big trucks were hauling all sorts of furniture and household goods away. In these camps, I saw pregnant women, and one was so heavy that a doctor was called to deliver her baby. Soon I was back upon the streets, but the building where I had my office was a smoldering ruin, and all my law books and office furniture fixtures had been consumed by flames. I went to where my rooming house had stood a few short hours before, but it was in ashes, with all my clothes and the money to be used in moving my family. As far as one could see, not a Negro dwelling house or place of business stood. Soon thereafter, as if by magic, there arose tents erected by the Red Cross, the greatest human institution that has ever existed. It furnished food and clothing for the adults and milk for the babies. Negroes who yesterday were wealthy, living in beautiful homes with ease and comfort, were now beggars, public charges, living off alms. When the ashes were still hot from the Holocaust, certain questionable real estate men influenced the mayor and city commissioners to enact an ordinance with an emergency clause prohibiting owners of lots in the burned area from rebuilding unless they could erect fireproof buildings. At the time, I had formed a law firm consisting of attorney I.H. Spears, T.O. Chappelle, and myself. We erected a tent as an office at 605 East Archer and employed Miss Effie Thompson as temporary secretary, since she and her husband had lost their drugstore in the fire. We immediately filed an injunction action against the city to enjoin and prohibit it from enforcing the ordinance. Among other things, we allege that the fire was not the fault of our client, Joe Lockhart, that to enforce such an ordinance would be equivalent to confiscation of property without due process. And further, that for all practical purposes, it would make the city a party to a conspiracy against the plaintiff and others similarly situated to despoil them of their property. It would be using the city for the selfish purpose of arraying citizens against each other, and such acts were outside the legitimate police power of the city. In the end, our client prevailed, but while the case was pending, a friend of ours was arrested 12 times because he persisted in rebuilding his home and place of business. We also instituted dozens of lawsuits against certain fire insurance companies who had insured properties of families and firms in the destroyed area. But in all cases where the policies did not insure against, quote, riots, civil commotion, unquote, and the like, no recovery was possible, fully 95% of the cases.
In reflecting upon the horrific violent onslaught in 1921 on the Greenwood district, known for its prosperity and culture as the Black Wall Street, it's important to note that the survivors did not accept their fate as victims, but continued to demand a just society. For them, it was not only a matter of rebuilding and persevering. Blacks in Tulsa filed over 100 lawsuits in the 1920s in order to obtain some kind of redress after armed white rioters killed an estimated 300 African Americans and left some 10,000 without homes. And yet none of the lawsuits was successful in the courts. There would be no justice. The many Black plaintiffs would receive no insurance to cover the extensive property damage. There would be no punishment meted out to members of the racist, murderous mob. There would be no semblance of a just society, not when government officials themselves were complicit in the massacre. Thus, the survivors' calls for justice met with outright rejection at the time. Not the slightest apology would come. The state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa reinforced a cloak of secrecy in regard to the massacre, and this climate of silence continued even after the publication in 1982 of Scott Ellsworth's Death in a Promised Land, The Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. That's the name of his book, which exposed new facts. By the late 1990s, more evidence continued to be unearthed, such that the Oklahoma State Legislature in 1997 authorized an investigation which resulted in the 2001 publication titled Final Report of Findings and Recommendations of the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. The evidence was so devastating that the commission made a startling recommendation. And let me read to you from the commission's report, and I quote it. In our interim report in February 2000, the majority of the commissioners declared that reparations to the historic Greenwood community in real and tangible form would be good public policy and do much to repair the emotional and physical scars of this terrible incident in our shared past. And the report went on to say, we listed several recommended courses of action, including direct payments to riot survivors and descendants, a scholarship fund available to students affected by the riot, establishment of an economic development enterprise zone in the historic Greenwood district, a memorial for the riot victims. And then the commission also stated, and I quote this, in the final report issued today, the majority of commissioners continue to support these recommendations. While each commissioner has their own opinion about the type of reparations that they would advocate, the majority has no question about the appropriateness of reparations. Despite the findings of this 200-page report, the Oklahoma legislature refused to pay. Instead, it allocated funds toward building a new reconciliation park, and with the financial aid of civic leaders, a bronze monument was erected and a pavement of memorials were laid where buildings once stood in Black Wall Street. This symbolic gesture was by no means sufficient. There would be no justice. In response, 150 Tulsa survivors sued the state of Oklahoma for its culpability in the destruction of Tulsa's historic African-American Greenwood district. And among those Tulsa survivors were Dr. Olivia Hooker and Dr. John Hope Franklin. The case is called John Melvin Alexander et al. Versus Oklahoma. And these Black plaintiffs sued as well the city of Tulsa, the mayor's office, and the local police, the Ku Klux Klan, the National Guard, and the legal system over the riot and its aftermath. In March 2004, the case came before the United States District Court for the Northern District of Oklahoma. The lawyers defending the city and the state moved to dismiss the suit on the grounds that the statute of limitations had long since passed. Now, it passed in 1923, just 2 years after the riot. The US District Court heard the case, but ruled against the victims of the riot, declaring that although the statute of limitations could have been delayed, the victims should have filed their lawsuit at an earlier time than they did. The court asserted that the commission report was valuable for providing evidence. It certainly had evidence of a long tragedy hidden from view, and the court acknowledged that the events of 1921 were a blight on the history of Tulsa and the state. But nonetheless, the federal district court ruled that despite all the troubling and convincing evidence in the commission report, and I quote the judicial opinion, that plaintiffs' claims are barred by the statute of limitations is strictly a legal conclusion and does not speak to the tragedy of the riot or the terrible devastation it caused, unquote. So while the justices are acknowledging the horrific nature of this, there would still be no justice in a society limited to technical, empty words devoid of humane and just conclusions. The Harvard law professor, Charles Willtree, who was one of the lawyers in this case, challenged the strictly legal conclusion and the court's reliance on a statute of limitations. He described a climate of silence and intimidation toward Blacks in Tulsa. And he referred to the many whites in the city and state who denied any wrongdoing when he stated, and I quote Charles Willtree, the mere passage of time and the possibility of a change of heart on behalf of the government and people of Oklahoma are insufficient to break the code of silence imposed in 1921 and perpetuated by 3 generations of Oklahomans. The United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit upheld the unfavorable district court ruling by refusing to give the case a hearing at all before the full court. The majority of the active judges believed that the Tulsa survivors could have taken legal action earlier. Judge Carlos F. Lucero wrote a powerful dissent, which was joined by Judge Stephanie Culp Seymour on the 10th Circuit. In fact, I liken the quality of Judge Lucero's dissent to the famous dissent of Justice John Harlan in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case. Harlan wrote of the specious doctrine of separate but equal, and I quote him, "The thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done." Well, in that same vein, Judge Lucero wrote, and I quote him, "It is inconceivable that a government investigation of the incident of September 11th would have failed to count every person who perished. Yet telling of the attitude that prevailed in Oklahoma in 1921 is that no effort was made to determine officially the number of those who died there. All subsequent claims raised by the victims fell upon the deaf ears of the court at the time, and most languished without even a cursory glance at the merits. In a perversion of justice," and these are the words of Judge Lucero, "a perversion of justice, a grand jury commissioned by the state exonerated the city and state and all white rioters and blamed the victims for the atrocity. This history alone raises a question of exceptional importance. The laudable recent investigation of this tragedy by the state of Oklahoma, and Judge Lucero is referring to the commission's report. That laudable investigation compels us, he wrote, to confront this tragedy. But once again, we witness, his words, a perversion of justice. In response, Charles Ogletree attempted to persuade the United States Supreme Court to require a more favorable standard for the determination of statutes of limitations in cases involving historic wrongdoing. The Supreme Court was not swayed by his argument and declined to hear the case in 2005. There would be no justice, no just society. When I teach about the Tulsa Race Riot, the Tulsa Massacre, in my course, African American Lives in the Law, which I taught at Duke University Law School in 2010, and I continue to teach to Harvard undergraduates and graduate students, my students are required to read Buck Franklin's autobiography, the Tulsa Commission report, and the court's opinion in John Melvin Alexander et al. Versus Oklahoma. I give them a writing assignment, and it goes like this. What would you have said to John Hope Franklin in May 2005 had you just learned of the Supreme Court's ruling? How would you describe the decision? Lamentable, understandable, inevitable? The Tulsa Race Massacre is a constant reminder that we, like our predecessors, must never give up. Because here, and I think of the words of the great lawyer, Brian Stevenson, we all have a responsibility to create a just society. We must do this. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leonel Kimble, and I'm the Vice President for Programs here at ASALH. Today, I have the privilege of serving as a moderator for the question and answer session regarding our program on the Tulsa riot and African American history with our National President, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Please feel free, if you haven't done so already, to type a question into the chat, and we'll try our best to answer them. Good evening, Dr. Higginbotham. How are you?
I'm fine.
Good. Well, I wanted to say that, I'm so very happy that ASALH was able to put this program on today. I think we're standing at a moment in history in which, we are initiating these very public conversations about urban rebellions and Tulsa and racial violence. And I think that celebrating or remembering the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre is a conversation that here at ASALH that we really want to engage our members in. So I think as we prepare to enter into this question and answer phase, I have a couple of questions that I want to pose and then take the opportunity to open it up to the members who are online tonight. And I think the most obvious question is, how do your students respond to that question you asked?
Right. So we have blogs. And so I asked them the very question I raised, and I will repeat it, that if you had been there in May 2005, when the Supreme Court said, we're not going to consider this case. It's been decided at the district court. We don't disagree with the Court of Appeals, so we're just not going to consider the case. What would you have said to him? And then I asked, would you be lament this? Would you just say it's inevitable? Would you be, how would you feel about it? And the students overwhelmingly are troubled. Now, I have had in the past some students who will write and say, well, there's nothing we could have done. I mean, this is the law, this is the precedent, this is the way it is, and there's really nothing that they really could have done, but it was good that they tried. And then there's another type of student who will write and say, it was inevitable. I could have told them that the court wasn't going to be just. And this is a cynicism that says that if you look at recent cases that have come before the court, especially come before at the state level, the local levels around police shootings of a child like Tamir Rice or others, that because there haven't been satisfactory decisions, that the judicial system falls short. And then there is this next type of student, and this is the overwhelming majority, Lionel, who are just extremely disturbed. They write, I would have told John Hope Franklin, I am devastated. I think this is a miscarriage of justice. I think this is lamentable. But what I find interesting about these students, and these are the majority who've expressed this, they're discussed over the years, is that they see this as not the end, but as the beginning to think about how to continue this struggle. Some will say things like, this tells us that it's important to go to court, but that going to court isn't all that we must be doing. And so they begin to talk about other things. How can we make people more aware? How can we raise the consciousness of voters who can make a difference in some of these cases? And so they talk, I would assume, in terms of deferred justice. And that's not to say that deferred justice is good, but it does say something about their willingness to put themselves in this process for change.
I think, as you mentioned, deferred justice, it kind of fits the paradigm of how Black people have used the courts historically, because, you know, even with the cynicism, I think it's important that what we tell our students is that even though they may have known that they wouldn't get their issue wouldn't find any redress in the courts, they still went there because it was this inherent belief that these ideas that these rights that were guaranteed by the Constitution should apply to them, even when reality was telling them no one is going to really, you know, protect or protect their rights in the courts, right? The important part of that conversation is that the willingness for them to go. But I also think that the questions that your students are giving you are doubly important, because it's really blending this old line way of using the courts as far as advancing civil rights, but merging it with some of their current ideas of how to fight for racial justice, right? About far as organizing, getting into the streets and building organizations and institutions to do that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. That's what they're saying.
Yeah. So I thought that was just fascinating, but, you know, but in thinking about the film, the documentary from the History Channel, but also thinking about the programs of Voices of Tulsa that we just did today. You and I had a conversation the other day about the public voice of the historian. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you want to share your opinion on the role of the historian in moving outside of the classroom, moving outside the academy, and really bringing stories like Tulsa and Chicago and all these other stories that are hidden, you know, heretofore hidden from us to the public light.
And this is so important. And Lionel, this is why Carter G. Woodson founded ASALH, to be quite candid. Because when Carter G. Woodson, our founder, Dr. Woodson, when he founded ASALH 106 years ago, he did so in a climate where segregation was law. And so the role of the historian, as far as he was concerned, was not simply to just teach us about the achievements of African Americans, although that was really important, but it was also about knowing our history so that we could fight for our rights. When you know your history, when you know about the role that African Americans have played in building this nation, in defending this nation, and making it all that it has been, then you know that you deserve equal citizenship, just like other Americans have, like white Americans have. And so that was always a part of what he believed in. And I do think it brings about deferred justice. I want to give you some examples of why historians are really important. And I want to tie it to the reparations story. So there was in 1906 something called Brownsville, the Brownsville case of 1906. And these were soldiers who were court-martialed. They were dishonorably charged. It just hurt their future, their jobs, just anything. But they were soldiers who were stationed in Brownsville, Texas. There had been a raid, some kind of event in the town of Brownsville, and these Black soldiers were charged. And when they were charged, there was evidence to show that they had not even left the barracks, and yet they were being charged. And so they were dishonorably discharged. And when this happened, the Black community was enraged. And they were enraged with Theodore Roosevelt, who was the president. And for the most part, they liked him better than previous presidents. But at the same time, our community was enraged. And so for decades, this was a story of injustice as far as the Black community was concerned. And then in 1970, the book came out called The Brownsville Raid by John Weaver. And it was an historical account. I think John Weaver was a journalist, but he was very detailed about the evidence. And when that came out in 1970, that historical publication, that book, there was a man named William Baker, who was an African-American and a lieutenant colonel in the Army in 1972. And so he was moved by that evidence and moved by even the stories that he had heard in his own family. And he began to push for the Army to reinvestigate this case. And he, in fact, William Baker has written his own book. He's no longer with us, but his wife, Betty Baker, has seen that book got published. And it's his memoir of how he went to also President Nixon and said, these men need to be pardoned. And that was successful. Well, when the Army took up the case, then California's first Black Congressman, Augustus Hawkins, then said, well, we're going to investigate the case. And that turned out to be a congressional inquiry, and they received, now most of them were dead by then, but the idea of reparations came out, and the man who was alive then received some money. The same thing, I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes when you lose the battle at one end, you still gain it. Now, the you who gains the victory might not be the actual person who fought the battle. And therefore, we are fighting battles for future generations. And just to give you another example, there was a very famous case called Korematsu versus the United States, and that was in 1944. And this was about the internment of Japanese Americans. And when we talk about hate crimes against Asian Americans, the internment of Japanese Americans in these concentration camps in the United States was a hate crime. Well, Korematsu lost. The Supreme Court absolutely did not think that internment was wrong. And yet later, by the 1980s, Congress, this is coming before Congress, and yes, Congress decides, and so does President Reagan, that reparations were due. So you got like a 40-year gap there. And then when you, here's another, Rosewood. Rosewood was another town leveled. This is in Florida, leveled completely in 1923, 2 years after Tulsa, but the Florida state legislature, and in those days, I mean, it was a coalition with African Americans and Hispanic Americans, but they really did work very hard to see that reparations were given to the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre. So while this isn't a victory, it's a deferred victory, but it says something about justice if we just keep struggling for it.
Indeed. I want to ask another question, because I think the logical conversation movement is to the question about reparations, because we have a couple of questions in the chat about that. But one of the things that I was moved about with this whole conversation on what went on in Tulsa and the resistance in Tulsa was the presence of Black servicemen, World War I servicemen, who were there to defense of their community. And as you know, some people on the line may know, I studied Chicago during a very similar period. And some of the stories coming out of the 1919 race riot were that Black men who were World War I veterans organized in defense of their communities. Could you talk a little bit about, the role of World War I soldiers during this period, and just to help the audience kind of conceptualize what it meant to be someone in uniform?
Well, I want to start by just emphasizing something that you know. We were in uniform from the founding of this nation. So this nation, when the colonies became the United States of America, they needed Black soldiers, and we were, our people were in the military, defending the right for this nation to be. And then we were soldiers in every single war, 1812, just name it. But importantly, we were soldiers in the Civil War. And I think the Civil War was especially important in this image of a Black man in uniform. I remember when our theme, the ASALH theme, every year we have a different theme. This year our theme is the Black family, but in 2018 it was African Americans in times of war. And we had our luncheon, and we had a Vietnam veteran, and he said that there was a history. I'll never forget the quote he used: "When we wear the cloth of our nation." And when we wear the cloth of our nation, what he meant was we wear the soldier's uniform. And when you wear the soldier's uniform, that is one of the highest duties of citizenship, to defend your country. And somehow just wearing that was an affront. And this was especially true during the Civil War, because after the war, during Reconstruction, in places like Memphis and other places, you had riots, and these are white-led riots. Don't think that riots only mean Black people are doing things, because that's simply not true. In fact, most of the riots in the 19th century and early 20th century are white rioters against Black property and towns. But the truth of the matter is, when they had those uniforms on, seeing that power of the United States on them was just too much. And so in the late 19th century, and especially during World War I, you literally had men lynched in uniform. And that just seems horrific. You know, it's hard to even understand how you would lynch somebody in uniform, but that defied to wear the cloth of the nation. And so in World War I, and this is the other really important point, I remember Du Bois, as you recall, he said we were going to fight shoulder to shoulder. And so put aside the fight for civil rights right now, because we've got to fight shoulder to shoulder to really make the world safe for democracy. Now, you know, he caught some slack for that, because we weren't having democracy at home. But after the war was over, he said in a very brilliant way, well, you know, we fought over there, so now we've got to come back fighting. And when he said we've got to come back fighting, he didn't mean come back and tear up neighborhoods. He meant come back and fight for your rights, because you fought for your country. And I think it's really telling, Lionel, that Memorial Day, when we honor those who gave their lives for their country, that this is the same time period when these soldiers are coming out and letting them know they fought for their country. They want to be treated like equals, and no, they don't want to see a lynching. But it is also a lesson for those who say, well, don't bother about nonviolence, just go out and get a gun, because that provoked the whole power of the government. And that's why you see bombs being dropped. In fact, I think I heard someone say in all of the, it might have been Ellsworth actually, who said that when we think of bombing, like what happened, the Oklahoma bombing in the 21st century, or in the late it was in the 1990s. When we think of that, that wasn't the first real devastation. The first bombing was when those bombs were dropping from those airplanes in Tulsa. And you know, that had some kind of local government authority, because your average person just doesn't have an airplane with
right.
bombs.
Right.
So this idea of being a soldier is both something that is honored, and yet it's something that is threatening to those who do not want to see equal justice for and equality of opportunity for African Americans.
And that's one of the things that Brittney Cooper brought out about this idea about the jealousy part.
If I could just tell you one short story about John Hope Franklin, because it's a wonderful, it's a troubling story. But one of the stories he says is that when he and his mother used to, ride on the train, and they would go from Reynoldsville to Tulsa, that during World War I, they did not have facilities to bathrooms on the train. They had to sit in Jim Crow, where German prisoners of war were treated equally on those trains. So that's yet another indictment.
So last question, this one comes from out of the chat. There's a number of themes that came out, but one of the big things was the issue of reparations. We saw in Evanston, Illinois, and other localities are passing some sort of reparation ordinances. Do you think that, as we revisit Tulsa now, do you think this can offer some momentum for a larger conversation for reparations?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think there are some cases for reparations that are more easily argued than others. So for example, and I say this in this sense, that Evanston's issue of reparations is specifically around its housing policy, okay? When you see some of these universities like Georgetown, it's specifically around their sale of slaves. I think when John Melvin Alexander and them took this to court, because they couldn't get it like Rosewood through the legislature, when they took it to court, I think they thought that this was probably a slam dunk case, but it wasn't. But I do think that with more attention, I think I think Tulsa, I think the survivors, there is a possibility to get reparations if we just keep this going and we get a United States Congress that supports justice like this, or vote for a state legislature in Oklahoma that supports justice like that. I think it's possible. But I do think that the broader story of reparations, the bigger story in so many places, is definitely enhanced by these kind of stories, because these stories of injustice demand restorative justice. They demand reparative justice. And so we just keep our feet to the freedom plow, as they said in the 60s.
I think that's a great way to end. Thank you very much, Evelyn, for this conversation.
Thank you. And thank you all for.
Thank you all. As we close out our program, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our esteemed panelists for participating in this important conversation about Black perseverance and Black agency in the face of this horrific episode of racial violence. It is our sincere thought here at ASALH that each of you leave this session armed with not only information to advocate for justice for the families of the Tulsa survivors, but also armed with the knowledge to help ensure that the story of Black Wall Street remains etched in our collective public memories and consciousness. This evening, we had the privilege to engage in topics through the words of individuals so important to the legacy of the association and all who left an indelible mark on our core mission. Even though they may no longer be with us physically, Dr. Hooker and Dr. Franklin still obviously have so much that they can still teach us all. Dr. Cooper, thank you again for your profound insight in historicizing the Tulsa riot and the larger framework of the 1920s. And Dr. John Franklin, many thanks for sharing the words of your grandfather. His words were so profound and so important and so powerful. His work on behalf of African Americans embodied the definition of doing true work for the race. This concludes our program. And on behalf of our national president, Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham, the officers of ASALH, the executive council, and the staff, I want to say a special thanks to the ASALH TV team for putting on this program, the History Channel, and all those responsible for this important documentary, the ASALH staff for putting this program together in such a short period of time, and most importantly, all of you for attending our program tonight. If you enjoy this program and others like them, please, I want to be notified for upcoming webinars and discussions. Please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, ASALH TV. That would be great. So hit the subscribe button. if you haven't done so already, and we'll see you at one of our upcoming programs. Also, make plans to register for our virtual conference this September and join the association, or better yet, join and encourage others to support the work of Dr. Woodson and join ASALH as well.